She was 47 years old when she almost drowned in the ground beneath her own feet. No one witnessed it. No one would have found her if the water had kept her down there and the land would have been quiet about it, the way land always is about what it takes. But that comes later. First, there was the morning, and the morning was already trying to kill her. The tin roof above the bedroom groaned before she opened her eyes. Not from wind. There was no wind. The metal was expanding under thermal pressure, swelling outward in the first hour of direct sun, and the sound it made was low and structural, like a house settling into the decision to finally give up. Nadine Roth sat up on the edge of the mattress, and the box springs sang under her, and the air in the room was already close, already thick with the particular staleness of a space that had not been cool since April. She sat there a moment. Her lower back had its say, first as it always did. A deep, grinding objection that started at the base of her spine and moved outward toward both hips, like something trying to split her apart from the inside. She was not an old woman. 47 was not old. But the land aged you faster than the calendar did, and she had been working this ground since she was 19, first beside her father, then beside her husband, then alone. The back knew all of it. It kept the record the way land keeps records, without sentiment and without omission. On the nightstand next to the lamp, she never turned on anymore because the bulb had been dead for 6 months and she had not bothered to replace it. There was a photograph in a plain wooden frame. Tom Roth, her husband. He was grinning in the photograph the way he grinned when he thought something was genuinely funny and was trying not to show it, which meant the corners of his mouth went crooked and his eyes did the work instead. He had been dead 8 years. The farm accident had been quick, which people said was a mercy, and she had accepted that framing for a while because there was no useful alternative. She looked at the photograph for the length of one breath. Then she reached down and pulled on her boots. The leather was cracked across the toe box of both gray-white from the alkali soil that had worked its way into every surface of the farm over the past 6 months. She laced them without looking, her fingers moving by memory. When she stood and her full weight came down the floor, gave a slight bow under her, the old pine boards soft from decades of use and neglect. The window beside the dresser showed her the sky. It was already bleached. Not pale blue, bleached. The color of bone left in the sun. She went outside. The heat did not ease into her the way heat does in softer places. It hit her at the door like something with intent. The porch boards were already hot through the soles of her boots. The yard between the house and the barn was cracked in a pattern she had memorized over the past weeks. Wide fissures running in irregular lines through the gray-brown topsoil, deep enough to lose a pocket knife in. She walked through the yard, and the dust lifted with each step, and the dust had no smell. That was the thing people did not understand about a drought this severe. The earth stopped smelling like earth. The wet smell, the living smell, the dark mineral scent of soil, with water in it, all of that, was gone. What replaced it was nothing. An absence. Like walking through a room where someone had died and all the furniture had been removed. 50 acres of winter wheat lay in the field to the south of the house. She walked to the edge of it. The stalks were the color of old bone, same as the sky, and when she crouched down and snapped one between her fingers, it did not bend first. It went straight to fracture clean and instantaneous, and the fragments crumbled in her palm. The cellular structure had lost every molecule of moisture. The crop was not dying. It was already dead. Had been dead for 2 weeks. She was just doing the accounting. She had known when the second week of June passed without measurable rain that the wheat was finished. She had gone on irrigating it anyway for 11 days after that, because stopping felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit, and because the cattle needed to see something green in the near distance, even if the green was borrowed and temporary and already becoming a lie. She walked to the cistern behind the barn. The concrete tank was 12 feet deep and held 4,000 gallons when it was full. She lifted the wooden access panel and looked down, and the darkness at the bottom was dry. Darkness, not wet darkness, and the walls had a white mineral residue at the old water line, like a bathtub ring 6 feet from the floor. She lowered the measure string anyway. It came back up with nothing on it. She went to the main well at the north corner of the property line, and she pulled the hand crank and lowered the test bucket down the pipe shaft. And she counted the seconds on the way down, and when it hit the bottom, there was a sound she had been dreading for 3 weeks. A dull, dry impact. Not a splash. The aquifer had dropped below her pump intake. The well was gone. She stood there with the empty bucket in her hands and the sun on the back of her neck, and she ran the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. No cistern, no well, 20 head of cattle in the lower pasture, her entire remaining herd after the sales and the culls, and the 2 that had simply lain down in the heat and not gotten up again. 20 animals that needed water today, not rationed water, not trucked water spread thin over 4 days. They needed it today in volume, or they would begin to go down one by one, and the ones that went down first were rarely the ones that got up again. She was still standing there when the sound of tires on the county road reached her. The pickup that turned into her driveway was a 1998 Ford Ranger Primer Gray on one door and rust on everything else, and it moved with the careful slowness of a vehicle whose driver knew exactly which ruts to avoid. Patsy Weaver. 71 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, white hair, cut close to her head, hands that had worked soil for 50 years and looked every day of it. She climbed out of the Ranger before it had fully stopped rolling, the way she always did, and she went around to the bed and lifted out a 5-gallon plastic can. Nadine walked toward her. Patsy set the can on the ground between them. "Drove to my son-in-law's last night," she said. "His well is still holding. That is enough for your cattle through the noon hour." Nadine looked at the can. Then she looked at Patsy. The can would buy 4 hours, maybe 5, if she kept the herd bunched away from the direct sun. "You need to call the bank," Patsy said. "Get on the emergency agricultural line. They have drought provisions. You can truck water in from Harmon County at subsidized rate." "I have the number written down." "The bank doesn't sell water," Nadine said. "No, but they can lend you the money to buy some while you still have collateral standing in that pasture." Nadine took the can. She said, "I'll figure it out." Patsy reached into the front pocket of her work shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. She said, "Gallagher Holdings filed a proposal with the county water board. They want a new distribution line run through the eastern edge of the valley. Filed for public comment period. 30 days starting last Thursday." Nadine took the paper and unfolded it. She read the relevant section twice. A county-authorized distribution line under Gallagher Holdings management would give Warren Gallagher what he had wanted for the last 15 years, formal legal access to the water distribution infrastructure of the valley under his own corporate name. Once that was in place, he would not need to sell water to struggling farms. He would simply be the mechanism by which water was or was not available to them. The distinction between those two positions was the difference between a man who profited from scarcity and a man who controlled it. She folded the paper and put it in her back pocket. "That's the 3rd piece of land he's picked up this year," Patsy said. Tillman was in November. Weems signed in February. He's coming around you from both sides now. Nadine said, "Thank you for the water, Patsy." Patsy looked at her for a moment. She was not a woman who pushed past the point where pushing did no more good. She had known Nadine Roth for 30 years, and she understood the particular silence that meant the conversation was finished. She went back to the Ranger, and she got in, and she drove back out the way she had come, carefully minding the ruts. Nadine carried the 5-gallon can toward the lower pasture. She heard Dale before she saw him. The side door of the house opened, and then the particular sound of her son's footsteps on the porch, the slightly too heavy tread of a young man who had grown up off the land and had never developed the instinct to move quietly across it. He came around the corner of the house with a ceramic mug of coffee in both hands and stopped when he saw her heading for the pasture. He was 22 years old, and he was taller than his father had been, and his hands were smooth in a way that Nadine noticed every time she looked at them. Not soft hands in the way of someone who had never worked, just unmarked. The hands of a person whose labor had all been indoor, theoretical labor that left no evidence on the body. He had been back for 6 days, called home from his apartment in Missoula by what she assumed was some combination of guilt and the news reports about the drought conditions in this part of the state. He had not said explicitly why he came back. She had not asked. He walked to the fence line and watched her set the can inside the gate. She said, "Get the bolt cutters from the south wall of the barn and check the lower fence line. 3rd post from the cottonwood is working loose." He said, "Mom, can we talk about the realistic options here?" She kept walking. Dale said, "I'm serious. The wheat is gone. The well is gone. You've got 20 head that are going to need water every day until you can get them to auction. That's the realistic math." She turned around. She looked at him. He was standing with both hands around the coffee mug, his shoulders slightly forward, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen on him since he was 12 years old, the one that meant he had already decided what the conclusion should be and was working backward from it. She said, "What do you think the land is worth right now?" He said, "I mean, in this condition, in this market, probably somewhere around 170,000 and 80,000. She was very still. 180,000 was not a number a 22-year-old who had lived in Missoula for 3 years and showed no interest in agricultural real estate would have arrived at independently. It was too specific. It assumed a buyer with a standing offer. And there was only one person in this valley who had been circling this property long enough to have a number ready. Dale did not appear to notice what he had just revealed. He was watching the cattle at the fence line, measuring their condition with the detached assessment of someone who had learned to look at a problem rather than feel it. She said, "Get the bolt cutters and check the fence." She turned back toward the pasture, and she did not look at him again until she heard the barn door open and close behind her. She distributed the water, slowly pouring it into the long trough in sections, keeping the herd from trampling each other in the rush. The cattle were too tired to rush. That was the real measure of how bad things had gotten. They moved to the water with slow deliberation, muzzles dropping into the trough, and the sound of their swallowing in the heat was the saddest mechanical sound she had heard in a long time. She stood at the fence rail and watched them drink the 5 gallons, down to nothing in under 4 minutes. Then they lifted their heads and looked at the empty trough and looked at her, and she turned and walked back to the house because there was nothing left in that particular exchange worth witnessing. She sat at the kitchen table with the county water board notice spread in front of her. She read it again. Then she went to the window above the sink and looked east where the land lifted toward the foothills and the tree line stayed a deep green, Even now, even in this, because the man who owned that high ground had drilled 300 feet through solid granite 20 years ago and tapped a subterranean reservoir that the rest of this valley would never reach. There was only one place in this valley with water to spare. She had known this for 3 days. She had been putting the knowing away each morning and taking it back out each night. Today, there was no more room to put it. She did not take the truck. The truck would have cost her 8 miles of fuel. She did not have to waste, and beyond that, there was something in her that required the punishment of the walk. The full experience of the distance between what she had and what she needed, measured in footsteps under a white sky, with no shade. The walk to Warren Gallagher's property took 50 minutes at the pace she set. She crossed her own land, first moving south through the dead wheat field, and then east along the county road. And as she passed the corner fence post at the southern edge of her property, she saw what she had been seeing for 3 months and had refused to think about too directly. A new post. Fresh treated lumber sunk 18 inches in clean concrete, still pale at the base where the contractor had been careful. A small metal sign, green letters on white, attached at eye level. Gallagher Holdings, Tillman Parcel, acquired November 2023. She walked another quarter mile, and there was a second sign on the eastern fence line. Same format, same green letters. Gallagher Holdings, Weems Parcel, acquired February 2024. 4 parcels now. The Tillman land to the south, the Weems land to the east, the Briggs land to the northeast that had gone 2 years ago, when old Leroy Briggs had his 3rd stroke and his children had signed everything over from a hospital waiting room in Billings. 3 sides of her property wrapped now in Gallagher Holdings and the county road to the west, the only boundary that had not changed hands. She thought about the geometry of it as she walked. A man does not acquire land on 3 sides of a neighbor without a plan for the 4th side. He simply waits for the right season. She walked and she did not look at the signs again. The temperature dropped when she crossed onto Gallagher land, and the change was violent enough to feel like a physical threshold being crossed. The cracked, gray, hard pan of the road gave way within 50 feet to dark loam, irrigated and damp and alive. And the irrigation ditches that ran parallel to the access lane were carrying water clear and fast and cold-looking, and the sound of it moving over smooth stone was a sound Nadine had not heard in 6 months except in memory. She stopped at the edge of the first ditch and looked at the water moving, and her throat constricted. She made herself look away, and she kept walking. The main house was visible from the bottom of the lane. 2 stories, white siding, freshly painted, wraparound porch on both levels and the grounds around it. Meticulously maintained in a way that required constant irrigation. Shaped hedges and thick lawn grass and flower beds with something still blooming in them. All of it sustained by the sound of sprinkler heads turning in their slow arcs, and the mist catching the sunlight in short rainbows that appeared and vanished as she walked toward the porch steps. The abundance of it was not incidental. A man who drilled 300 feet through solid granite to reach water had done so with a full understanding of what that water would mean in a dry year. He had bought his insulation from exactly this kind of morning, deliberately decades in advance, and the green lawn and the blooming hedges were not luxury. They were the visible surface of a long calculation. She stopped at the base of the steps and looked down at her boots. The alkali dust and the cracked soil from her property had traveled with her and left its evidence on the clean, painted wood of the bottom step and the first board of the porch. She did not wipe it off. She stepped up onto the porch and walked to the front door and knocked. Warren Gallagher was a large man, not fat, but built heavily through the shoulders and chest. The kind of build that suggested a younger life of real physical labor and a middle age comfortable enough to preserve the frame without the work. He was 55 years old, and he wore a clean flannel shirt with the cuffs rolled to the elbows, and he was holding a glass of iced tea when he opened the door, and the first thing Nadine saw when the door opened was the condensation on the outside of the glass. The beads of cold water on warm glass, one drop sliding down and falling onto the porch boards. "Warren," she said. "Nadine." He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the confident ease of a man who had not needed to recalculate a situation in a long time. "Hell of a morning for a walk. Truck giving you trouble?" "The truck is fine," she said. "I need to talk to you." He stepped back from the door in a way that was not quite an invitation and was not quite a refusal. Just a broadening of the available space, and she stepped up onto the porch but did not go inside. He let the door close behind him and leaned against the porch railing with the tea glass in one hand, relaxed and composed, and watching her with the kind of attention a man pays to something he does not expect to surprise him. She said it plainly. "My well bombed out 2 days ago. Cistern's been dry for a week. I've got 20 head in the lower pasture, and they'll start dying today if I don't get water to them. I need a water loan, 1 tanker fill, maybe 2. Enough to keep the cattle standing until I can get the auctioneer out. I'll pay you back at double the county rate when the herd sells." He was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the yard, over the green lawn and the shaped hedges and the turning sprinklers, then back at her. He said, "Nadine, I respect what you're doing out here. I mean that. But water isn't just water anymore. Not in a year like this. My pumps are running 20 hours a day to keep my own acreage where it needs to be. I opened the tap for one neighbor, and I'm setting a precedent and dropping my own pressure. I'm not asking for the valley," she said. "I'm asking for 20 head of cattle in 3 weeks." He swirled the ice in his glass. He said, "Pay you back with what, though? Honestly, what does your herd sell for right now at auction in this condition? You'll get distress pricing on distress animals. That money clears your current debt and there's nothing left over. You know that math better than I do." She said, "The land is collateral." Warren looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not contempt, something more deliberate. He said Tom Roth was a man who knew his own land. He understood the cycles. He came to me once, years ago, and I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. The difference is, Tom understood what I was telling him. He knew when to hold and when to let something go. She felt the cold come into her hands before she understood why. Not anger. Cold. Her fingers straightened at her sides like something draining out of them. Warren said, "I'm saying this as a neighbor, Nadine. Tom would not want you going down with this ship out of pride. He'd want you to make the smart call." She looked at him. He had just used her dead husband to tell her what her dead husband would want. He had lifted Tom Roth out of the ground and put words in his mouth and pointed them at her, and he had done it in the measured tone of a man dispensing reasonable advice. And the particular quality of the silence that followed was the silence of something having been broken that could not be repaired. She had come up this hill prepared for a hard negotiation. She had not prepared for Tom's name in Warren Gallagher's mouth being used as an instrument. Warren seemed to take her silence as the absence of a counter-argument. He pointed south toward the visible edge of her property from the height of his porch, a brown smear against the gray-white of the valley floor. He said, "You know what you could do. You could try that old borehole your daddy put in down by the ravine. Clarence Roth and his shortcut to China." He laughed, a short exhale of genuine amusement at his own joke. "Go down there and spit in it. Maybe you'll get enough for a mud puddle." He drank from his tea glass. The ice clinked. Nadine said nothing. She looked at him for 3 seconds with her straight hands at her sides and her face entirely still, and she turned and walked down the porch steps. He called after her. "Get that auctioneer on the line, Nadine. Sooner the better in weather like this." The screen door closed behind him. She walked back down the long gravel lane, and she did not look at the irrigation ditches or the sprinklers or the green lawn. She looked straight ahead at the county road and the cracked gray distance beyond it, and the temperature climbed back into her. The moment she crossed the property line, and the smell of alive soil was replaced with the absent smell of her own land, and she walked in the heat with the particular kind of shame that lives below. Anger, the kind that does not burn but corrodes. She did not think about the cattle on the way back. She thought about the hole. The old bore shaft was down in the ravine on the south end of the property, partially hidden now by 20 years of volunteer brush and blown debris. Her grandfather had commissioned the drilling in the late 1970s when an earlier drought had made the main well unreliable. The Wildcat crew had gone 80 feet, hit a plate of solid basalt, shattered 3 drill bits, and walked off the job. The hole had been a storage site for everything that needed to be out of sight since then. Old tires, broken fence posts, a roll of barbed wire so rusted it had fused into a single mass. The kind of hole a family uses when they want to forget something, without the trouble of disposing of it properly. Clarence Roth, her father drilling his shortcut to China. Warren had said it like a punchline, like the hole was its own argument. She got back to the property and went to the barn. She had been in the machine shed for less than 20 minutes when she heard another vehicle on the county road, this one slowing for her driveway and turning in. She came to the shed doorway and watched it park. A white pickup, 10 years old and clean, Earl Decker. He ran the rendering facility at the county line, a low gray building behind a chain-link fence that most people in the valley preferred not to think about too carefully. He was a small man, wire-thin, with a permanent expression of mild impatience, and the faint smell of industrial bleach on his clothes even out here in the open air. She had not called him. She looked at where he had come from. He had turned in from the west. The rendering facility was 12 miles east. He had been parked somewhere in the valley waiting, and the only question was whether he had come because someone told him to, or because he had learned over 20 years to sense the specific pressure gradient of a farm about to break. He walked to the lower pasture fence and looked at the herd without speaking. For a long moment, taking inventory with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades seeing animals at the end of their value. He said, "Drought finally broke you?" She said, "Just thinning the herd." He pulled his notebook from his chest pocket and wrote something she could not see. He tapped his pen against the top fence rail and said, "They're stressed, dehydrated. Meat's going to be tough. I can't give you market rate for animals in this condition. I'm looking at utility grade at best." "They're young," she said. "They have frame. You know what they're worth to a feedlot that has water and grain." He said, "I know what they're worth to a feedlot with water and grain. I also know what they're worth to me right now. 30 cents a pound. Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, you'll be digging holes for them by morning." 30 cents was theft. It was less than a quarter of their value. She did the arithmetic in the 20 seconds of silence she allowed herself before she answered. 5 animals at 30 cents a pound would give her somewhere north of $5,000 if they were heavier than she was calculating them at right now. $5,000 was a submersible pump pipe and wire. She did not know with certainty that a pump and pipe and wire would produce anything useful. But the alternative was standing in this driveway, watching a man she had not called drive away with his check uncashed while her cattle died in the lower pasture. She said, "Write the check." He wrote it. She signed the transfer papers. They loaded the cattle, 5 of the heaviest steers animals she had watched be born, and had dewormed by hand and had moved through 3 pasture rotations. The ramp clanged shut behind them with a sound like a vault door, and Decker walked back to his truck. Before he opened the door, he stopped and turned back toward her, and he said it without looking at her directly. Said it in the flat tone of a man delivering a message he had been asked to deliver and had no personal stake in. Warren Gallagher wants you to know he's prepared to offer $180,000 for the full property whenever you're ready to talk. Better you get that number than whatever the bank will let it go for in foreclosure. She looked at the back of his head. He opened the truck door and climbed in. She said, "What time did he call you this morning?" Decker put the truck in gear and drove out without answering. She stood in the empty driveway and listened to the trailer rattle until it was gone. $180,000. The exact number her son had used this morning, working it into the conversation like something he had calculated on his own. She thought about Dale's face when he had said it, the way he had not quite looked at her when the number came out of his mouth, the way he had looked at the cattle instead, as though the cattle were the relevant subject and not the amount of money that would transfer this property from her hands into Warren Gallagher's. She thought about how long a man would need to work on a 22-year-old before the 22-year-old stopped noticing the work. She went back into the house. She had to move the grain ledgers from the bottom desk drawer to find the bolt cutters she had told Dale to get from the barn, which meant Dale had not done what she asked, which meant Dale had left while she was out. She stood at the desk with the grain ledgers stacked in her hands, and then she set them on the desktop, and her hand came to rest on a small, leather-bound notebook beneath them. She recognized it immediately. The cover was dark brown, almost black from age, and the spine was cracked in 2 places. Her father's handwriting on the inside cover, Clarence L. Roth, Farm Records and Observations. She had not seen it in 3 years, had assumed it had been lost when she reorganized the office. She sat down and opened it. Most of the pages were what she expected. Water usage logs, cattle weight records, seed purchase receipts written in her father's careful printing. The numbers lined up with the tidiness of a man who had grown up in a time when misplacing a figure could mean the difference between a winter with food and a winter without. She turned pages without reading closely, running her thumb along the edges until something stopped her. August 14th, 1987. A full entry, longer than the surrounding one, the handwriting, slightly more compressed as if he had been writing quickly or in low light. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. Went back to the old bore shaft in the south ravine. Dug by hand to clear the debris at the bottom, maybe 3 hours of work. At approximately 70 feet down, below the first basalt plate, there is a vibration in the substrate that has no obvious geological cause. Rhythmic, low frequency. It does not match the pattern of settling rock or thermal expansion. It feels like pressurized fluid movement through a confined channel. Could be an isolated pocket. Could be a sub-aquifer branch following the western fault line. Drill bits already destroyed on the basalt plate. Cost of new equipment too high to continue. Noting this observation for the record, she turned the page. The next entry was from 1989, 2 years later in the same handwriting, but slightly looser, the pen pressure uneven. Returned to the bore shaft. Left the survey sketch inside, wrapped and sealed, tied to the rope at depth. In case someone needs it later. She sat with the notebook open in her lap for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window above the desk in a long flat bar and moved across the floor. Somewhere in the lower pasture, the remaining cattle were quiet, which meant the water Patsy had brought was already gone, and they were too tired to make any sound about it. Her father had felt the vibration in 1987, had known something was down there, had made a sketch, had wrapped it in something and lowered it back into the hole, and sealed it there for whoever came next, for whoever was angry enough or desperate enough or stupid enough to go down after it. He had not been a man without courage. She knew that. He had simply been a man without a reason sufficient to the risk. There was a difference between those things, and she had spent enough hard years understanding it. Warren Gallagher had laughed at that hole today, had pointed at it from his clean porch with his iced tea in his hand, and used it as the final insult. Go spit in it, Nadine. See what you get. She closed the notebook. She looked at the window. Outside, the light was going orange with the descending sun, the long shadows coming off the barn, and the fence posts and the dead wheat field pointing east like accusations. She thought about the basalt plate at the bottom of the shaft. She thought about drill bits shattering on rock that had been sitting there containing something for longer than anyone in this valley had been alive. She thought about the number $180,000 sitting in Dale's mouth this morning, like a key he had been given and was waiting to use. There were 3 good reasons not to go down that shaft. She could name all 3 without effort. The structure of the walls after 45 years of weathering and seismic activity. The absence of any working safety equipment rated for that depth. The single fact that if something went wrong 80 feet underground, there would be no one within earshot, and no one who knew to come looking. She knew all 3 reasons. She held them in her mind, and she set the notebook on the desk and stood up. She went to the machine shed to start pulling equipment. Nobody knew she was going down. That was the first thing she understood clearly as she dragged the A-frame tripod out of the machine shed in the last of the evening light. If the shaft took her, if the walls caved, or the cable snapped, or the water she was hoping for arrived too fast and too hard for one person to handle alone, the cattle would drink the last of what remained in their trough, and then they would stand, and then they would lie down, and the farm would go quiet, in a way it would not recover from. She thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Then she picked up the other leg of the tripod and kept dragging. The Ingersoll Rand winch came off the high shelf in the back of the shed, a unit she had not run since she and Tom had pulled a seized engine block from the old Massey Ferguson 15 years prior. The cable was still on the drum, 3/8-inch galvanized steel, and she ran a full length of it through her hands in the truck headlights checking for frays. One section near the 40-foot mark was kinked, but the individual strands held. She marked it with a twist of orange wire and kept going. She built the rig at the edge of the shaft. Tripod legs driven into the cracked dirt at 3 points around the opening ground, stakes hammered 2 blows each in the silence of the valley, with nothing to absorb the sound. The winch bolted to the apex. Cable down through the block and tackle. She built the climbing harness from a coil of rope on the shed's south wall, a system Tom had taught her for clearing a collapsed drainage culvert in the early years of the marriage, and clipped the chest loop to the main cable with a steel carabiner. She went to the workbench and pulled open the top drawer. Tom's black diamond headlamp was where it had always been sitting, in the same groove it had worn into the drawer liner over the course of 20 years. She clicked it on and pressed the beam against her palm to read the battery strength. Strong and white. She adjusted the strap on her head and buttoned her left chest pocket over her father's notebook and went back to the shaft. She sat on the edge with her legs over the side. The dark below had no opinion about her. The air coming up was 30 degrees colder than the surface air, and it carried the specific smell of compressed geological time mineral and organic, and sealed the smell of a place that had not moved in a very long time. She released the winch brake and stepped backward off the edge. The claustrophobia came at 30 feet, unannounced and total. The walls were not close enough to touch on both sides, but her mind measured them as if they were, and the chest tightened, and the breathing went shallow, and she fixed her eyes on the beam of Tom's headlamp and watched the wall moving past her until her breathing steadied. She did not speak. There was no one to speak to. At 40 feet, the limestone gave way to a darker formation, and the air changed again, took on an older quality, something that had not been disturbed since before her father first dropped a rope into this shaft. At 60 feet, the debris field started. Old wire, rotted lumber, the skeleton of a coyote that had gone in years ago and made its permanent residence. She sat down and began to work. The night went in bucket loads. Wire and wood and rubber and compacted debris, haul after haul, the winch carrying weight to the surface, and the empty bucket swinging back down to her in the dark. She had brought strips of flannel to wrap her palms against the wire. When the wire cut through the flannel, she rewrapped and kept going. The hours dissolved the way hours do when the body is fully committed to a single repetitive task and the mind has gone somewhere quieter than thought. She did not think about Warren. She did not think about Dale, or the $180,000, or the dead wheat. She thought only about what was in the bucket, and what needed to be in the next bucket. Past midnight, she crouched over a cleared section of floor and pressed her palm flat against the substrate and felt the change immediately. Dense, cold, a deep, bruised purple-gray in the headlamp beam entirely different from the dry red-brown she had been working through above it. She was pressing harder, trying to feel for what the notebook had described, when her fingers found an edge. A wrapped bundle canvas tied with rope, so old it had gone soft. She worked it free. Inside the canvas was a folded piece of oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth was her father's survey sketch, preserved in the airless dark, long enough to remain legible. Pencil lines careful and precise. A cross-section of the terrain from the western ridge through the valley floor. A dotted line that was not vertical. It entered the sketch from the upper left from the direction of the western fault escarpment, and it traveled down and east at roughly 40 degrees through substrate. Her father had marked at 90 to 110 feet depth, directly beneath the Roth property boundary. She sat at the bottom of the shaft at 2:30 in the morning, and she understood 3 things in fast succession. This was not a pocket. It was a channel. Moving water following the fault line under pressure, sealed behind a basalt ceiling for longer than anyone in this valley had been alive. Warren Gallagher had drilled 300 feet straight down through granite and reached the main aquifer on the high ground. But a vertical bore could not intersect a diagonal channel without first knowing the channel existed and then drilling at an angle through property that was not his. He had never touched this water. He could not touch this water, and he knew about it. He had stood on his clean porch with condensation on his glass and pointed at this shaft and laughed, and the laugh had not been contempt. It had been a man who needed her to believe the whole was worthless. Contempt does not need to direct attention. Fear does. She folded the sketch and put it in her chest pocket with the notebook. She pressed both palms flat against the floor and felt the vibration her father had written about in 1987. The low rhythmic pulse of pressurized water, moving through a confined channel, felt in the back teeth more than the ears. Then she reached for the trenching shovel and cleared the last layer of clay from the basalt surface. She went up and brought the compressor down in stages. The Ingersoll Rand commercial compressor and the 90-pound pneumatic breaker took 3 trips and 40 minutes to move to the shaft head. She wrapped every hose coupling with 3 layers of industrial tape working by the truck lights. The last of the red-dyed diesel from the outbuilding tank went into the compressor. She hit the start cord, and the machine coughed black smoke. and settled into the sustained roar of a large engine working hard. She lowered the breaker on a secondary rope and went down after it. The space at the bottom, with the 90-pound machine in it, left her barely enough room to plant her feet. She positioned the chisel at the center of the basalt where the vibration was strongest, wrapped both hands around the T-handles, braced her back against the curved limestone wall, and pressed the trigger. The sound had nowhere to go. It bounced between walls 12 inches from her ears and converted itself into pressure before it could register as noise, and the pressure was inside her skull in the first second, the recoil coming through her palms and wrists and shoulders in a continuous hammering, too fast to parse as separate impacts. Rock dust exploded upward and filled the shaft with white fog, and she closed her eyes and held the trigger down and leaned her full weight into the machine. She thought about Warren Gallagher's glass of iced tea. She thought about the number $180,000 in her son's mouth. She bore down. She released the trigger after 3 minutes. The silence was a physical presence. She coughed up dense gray paste and put the headlamp beam on the basalt. 2 inches deep. Fine fracture lines radiating outward from the impact point. From 2 of the fractures, a mist hissed, freezing and thin, carrying a smell that had never been above ground in living memory. She repositioned the chisel into the center of the fracture pattern and pressed the trigger. First strike, 1/2 inch deeper. Second strike, the fracture lines widened. Third strike, the pitch changed. The basalt stopped ringing and started groaning, the structural sound of loaded material finding its failure point. She did not stop. The fourth strike went in and kept going, and she had a 1/2 second of understanding before the floor of the world fell out. The detonation was a deep, cylindrical concussion that hit her chest like a closed fist and drove the air from her lungs. The basalt did not crack in a line. It disintegrated in a 4-inch circle, and what came through the opening had been waiting under pressure since before this valley had a name. The column hit the 90-pound breaker and sent it into the limestone wall as though it weighed nothing at all. The same force hit Nadine in the chest and hammered her into the opposite wall, and the back of her head hit stone hard enough to pull white light across her vision. Tom's headlamp impacted the wall, shorted, and went dark. Total darkness, total cold, total roar. Water that had been sealed for centuries came through an 8-inch opening in absolute blackness, and it did not accommodate anything in its way. She lost her sense of vertical for 2 full seconds. The water found her knees and then her thighs, and the cold was not temperature anymore. It was a command, her muscles contracting without her permission, her lungs refusing to expand fully. She found the wall with both hands. She found the cable. She wrapped her right hand around the steel and then her left, and she found the winch control box with numb fingers and jammed the toggle upward. Nothing. The water was at her waist. She jammed the toggle again and understood in the same moment that the control electronics were submerged and dead, and that waiting for the motor was the last mistake she would ever make if she kept doing it. She started climbing, both hands on the cable boots against stone. No purchase. Swinging back into open space, and pulling by arm strength alone in total blackness. At 20 feet, her left foot found a limestone ledge, and she planted it, and pushed, and her full weight transferred through her arms, and her left shoulder did what it had been building toward. The sound was interior, a deep, wet, mechanical pop. The pain that followed it was white and structural, the kind that communicates permanent change rather than temporary sensation. Her left arm dropped on the cable and caught, and her right arm was still holding, and her left hand was still gripping, and the shoulder was wrong in a way it would not be right again, and she kept climbing. Right hand over left. right hand over left. She could not use the left arm fully, and she used it anyway. Used the grip and dragged the arm upward by torso rotation with each stroke, and the cable cut through the gauze and through the palm beneath it, and the blood made the cable slick, and she wound her fingers tighter and moved. 40 feet. 50. She did not look down. She looked up. The opening of the shaft was a circle of pre-dawn gray, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. A pale coin at an impossible distance, and she moved toward it one pull at a time until her right hand crested the edge, and she threw her arm over the lip and dug her fingers into the dirt, and rolled her body sideways over the rim and hit the ground on her right side. She lay on her back with her chest heaving. The sky above her was the purple gray of 5 a.m. Her left arm was at a wrong angle against the ground, and she moved it with her right hand and laid it across her stomach, and the pain of moving it was already an old familiar. She was soaked from the skin out. The blood from her palms had run down on her wrists and dried in dark lines along the tendons. She reached into her left chest pocket. The notebooks were there. The oilcloth had held. She picked up a rock with her right hand and dropped it into the shaft. It hit water, not bottom. She listened to the echo and measured the distance. Somewhere close to 60 feet of standing water, in an 80-foot shaft filling and stabilizing as it equalized with the pressure of the channel below. She lay her head back on the hard dirt and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. And she let it run until her ribs ached, and the cattle in the lower pasture made a sound that ended it. She got up. The drive to the agricultural supply depot took 35 minutes with one working arm. She had strapped her left side to her body with baling twine, pinning the arm against her ribs so it would not swing with the road. The man behind the supply counter looked at her face, and then at the endorsed check, and then at the items on her list without asking a single question. A Gould's 10GS submersible pump, 5 horsepower, rated to 120 feet. 20 lengths of Schedule 80 PVC. Heavy gauge electrical cable for 90 feet, plus the generator run. When he set the last pipe length on the counter, he paused and went to the back shelf and brought out a roll of Gorilla Tape and placed it on top of the stack without adding it to the bill. He did not look at her while he did it. She did not say anything. Some transactions between people who understand what hard work actually costs do not require language. She loaded the truck from her right side and drove back. Gluing C-joints with one functional arm was a problem she solved by bracing the pipe against her knee and working the cement applicator with her right thumb. She reinforced every joint she was uncertain about with the tape from the counterman. The pump went down, last attached to the bottom pipe section, lowered hand by hand and quad bike by quad bike into the shaft, the bike doing the sustained work her body could not. She felt the pump submerge through the vibration change in the pipe. She ran the power cable up the shaft wall and connected it to the portable generator and routed the discharge hose from the pipe head into the dry bed of the main irrigation ditch running south toward the lower pasture. The generator started on the second pull. She walked to the end of the discharge hose and stood in the dry ditch and watched. 15 seconds. The hose moved a full body spasm, and a blast of compressed air punched out the end. Then the first water came. Black and heavy, with suspended minerals, it hit the cracked earth of the ditch with enough force to tear the surface. The color ran through brown to gray, to something approaching translucent within 2 minutes, and the chill of it reached her from 2 feet away. She watched it fill the ditch. She watched it crest the bank and move downhill. She opened the pasture gate and the water moved through, and the cattle smelled it from 40 feet away, and they moved toward it in the lurching, concentrated urgency of animals that had understood, without language, exactly how close the end had been. She put both hands in the flow. The cold went through her torn palms like something that hurt and restored at the same time. She cupped her right hand and drank. It tasted of iron and ancient stone and sulfur, underneath a taste no one would ever describe as good. And she drank 3 more handfuls, and then she sat down in the wet grass beside the running ditch and let the exhaustion of the previous 30 hours take her somewhere below thought. She woke to footsteps on gravel. The sun was fully up. Dale was standing at the fence line, looking at the running ditch, and then at the pump hose, and then at the generator, working in the distance. He had come back. She had told him to leave, and he had come back with the particular expression of a person who has been sitting somewhere deciding what to do, and has chosen to face the thing rather than drive away from it permanently. She sat up. Her left arm filed its report. She noted it and moved on. Dale said, "Mom, how did you?" She said, "Come over here." He came through the gate and crouched beside her. He was looking at the cuts on her face and the strapped arm, and his expression moved through something complicated and genuine. She said, "Where did you get the number?" He looked at the water moving in the ditch. She said, "Not from a listing, not from a bank assessment. It was too specific and you gave it too naturally. He gave you the number and you used it like it was your own arithmetic. Tell me when he called." Dale said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 3 weeks ago. He said the property was worth more to him than it would bring at bank auction. He said he wanted to be fair. She said, "And you were going to persuade me." He said I thought it was the only way out. She said, "Out for who?" He did not answer that. He looked at the cattle standing in the overflow around the trough, their sides moving with the deep breathing of animals that had come back from the edge, and he had the look of a man who has just been forced to understand something about himself that he did not previously want to know. She said, "Go home, Dale. Not because I'm angry, because I need you to sit with what you just told me until you understand what it actually means." He stood. He started to speak and did not. He walked back to his truck, and she heard the engine and the tires on the gravel and then the road. She stayed beside the running water until the generator's fuel ran low and she had to go refill it. Then she went to work. The seasons changed after that. The way seasons change inside a long war, marked less by weather than by incremental shifts in the position of things. She planted sorghum where the wheat had been a crop that did not care about the mineral content of the water or the smell that came with it, and the fields grew thick and dark green and ugly and profitable in a way the winter wheat had never managed. The irrigation ditches stained the deep orange red of oxidized iron, and the sulfur smell moved through the property on any wind, and she stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the particular sound of a house you have lived in long enough. The black oil field storage tanks she bought at scrap auction and welded together at the ravine head looked exactly like salvaged industrial infrastructure on agricultural land, because that was what they were. The pump ran 20 hours a day, and the sound of it carried across the valley. In the 3rd year, Warren Gallagher's holding company submitted a formal objection through the County Grain Cooperative to the purchase of Roth Farm commodity sorghum, citing mineral content irregularities. He held a board seat. The objection passed by 3 votes. She drove 80 miles north to the regional commodity buyer. The following week brought 2 years of yield records and a certified lab analysis and signed a 5-year supply contract at 12% above the co-op rate. On the way home, she stopped at a payphone and called Leroy Briggs, whose family land Warren had absorbed the year before, and gave him the regional buyer's contact number. It was the longest personal conversation she had with anyone in the valley that calendar year. In the 8th year, Patsy Weaver called before dawn. She had heard secondhand from the wife of a county board employee, heard it at a hair appointment, that Warren had filed an EPA compliance complaint against Roth Farm. The allegation was that the artesian discharge introduced heavy mineral contamination into a shared subsurface water system, constituting a violation under state groundwater statutes. 3 days later, a county-issue SUV came down the road and parked outside the gate. Roy Keller, dark vest clipboard, the carefully neutral expression of a government employee trained to deliver regulatory news without accepting personal responsibility for it. He read from the compliance order. She let him finish. Then she went inside and came back out with both notebooks and the oilcloth survey sketch and set them on the hood of his vehicle. He read them standing in the gravel for 20 minutes. He was careful with the old paper, she noticed. He turned the pages with 2 fingers, and when he reached the sketch, he held it flat with his palm and studied the diagonal line her father had drawn for a long time. It was the attention of a man who understood what he was looking at and was taking the time to understand it correctly, rather than the time required to close the matter. He said, "I need to run a geological verification on the subsurface classification. The compliance order is suspended during active investigation." She said, "Put it in writing." He wrote out the suspension on a second form, signed it, and passed it through the gate. He started to say something else, and then appeared to decide against it. He got back in the SUV and drove out. She did not see Warren Gallagher's vehicle anywhere on the road, but she understood he was close enough to hear the result quickly. 4 years after that, Decker appeared in the driveway for the second and final time. He did not get out of his truck. He rolled the window down and said Warren Gallagher wanted to purchase the 20-acre parcel surrounding the South Ravine. He said $40,000. The South Ravine was where the shaft was, where the pump was, where the water came from. She said, "Get off my property." Decker reversed out without another word. She never saw his vehicle on her road again. The 16th year Patsy sold. She had held the farm longer than anyone had expected. And one February morning, she signed the papers, and that was the end of 3 generations of Weaver land in this valley. She drove to the Roth place the week before the closing and sat on the porch without being invited the way she always had, and set a small tin box on the rail between them. Her biscuit recipe written in her own hand on an index card. She said, "In case you ever need something from before all this." She left without ceremony, without the kind of extended farewell that would have required Nadine to perform feelings she was not prepared to perform, and that restraint was the most generous thing Patsy had ever done for her. The Roth property was now flanked on 3 sides by Gallagher Holdings parcels. The county road to the west was the only boundary that remained. 20 years. The valley was largely Gallagher land. Her property was the interruption, the ugly industrial interruption, with its black tanks, and its sulfur smell, and its generator running through the night. She was 67 years old. The left shoulder had calcified into a permanent grinding limitation she accommodated without discussion. Her hands were scarred leather, mapped with the white lines of old cable cuts. The farm survived. It was not beautiful, and it was not quiet, and it was not what her father had built or what Tom had maintained, but it was standing, and it was hers, and the pump ran on. One morning in August, she was in the machine shed, running a new edge onto a mower blade, when she heard tires on the county road slowing. She looked through the shed doorway. Roy Keller's county SUV turned into the approach. Moving behind it, hanging back on the road itself as though not quite willing to come onto her property, was a second vehicle. Late model truck, clean. She set the angle grinder down. She wiped her one good hand on her canvas jacket and walked outside. Roy came to the fence line. He had the clipboard, the same instrument, or an identical replacement, and he read from a new document. A formal notice regarding the Gallagher Holdings water distribution proposal, now in its second submission cycle. The new filing included a provision for independent hydrological assessment of all private water sources in the affected distribution zone. Her property was listed by parcel number as a subject of that assessment. She said, "That is the same filing from 8 years ago with amended dates." He said, "The scope has been expanded to include subsurface assessment rights." She was quiet. Behind his vehicle, the clean truck had not moved. The driver had not gotten out. She said, "Who authorized the subsurface provision?" He said, "It was added at the committee level. I can provide the full amendment record on request." She looked at the truck on the road. She looked at Roy. He did not look away from her, but something in his expression shifted barely just enough. She said, "Who is in that truck?" Roy turned and looked at the road and looked back at her, and the answer was in the half-second before he spoke. She said, "You have 2 weeks to provide the full amendment record and the geological basis for the subsurface provision. Certified mail to this address. Until I receive that documentation, no assessment occurs on this property. I have standing under state statute to require that documentation before any compliance action." Roy said, "Ms. Roth." She said, 2 weeks. She turned back toward the machine shed, and she heard behind her the quiet, particular sound of a man standing at a gate with no remaining move available to him, and the truck on the county road that had not moved, and the generator in the distance running steady, and the low thud of the pump working 80 feet below the south ravine, drawing from a channel her father had found and marked and left for someone angry enough to go down and claim it. 3 years before Warren Gallagher appeared at her gate, she watched the first sign of his decline from the service road running along her eastern fence line. His corn had gone in as usual that spring, straight road, and dense the dark green of a well-irrigated crop in early June. By August, the color had shifted. Not dramatically. Just a half shade toward yellow along the eastern margin of his lowest field, the field furthest from the high-ground water source. She noted it. She went back to work. The following year, the eastern margin was wider. The yellow went to brown before September, and she could see from her own fields that he had shut down the pivot sprinklers on the lower acreage to concentrate pressure on the upper. A defensible management decision, but a decision made in response to a constraint, and the constraint was water, and the water was going somewhere it had not gone before. She understood what was happening in the aquifer below his land. A well that produces at full capacity for 20 consecutive years. In a drought cycle of increasing severity does not fail all at once. It fails by degree. The static level drops incrementally a foot per season, 3 feet, until the intake is drawing against declining pressure, and the pump works harder for less. She had watched it happen to 3 other properties in the valley before they failed entirely. She had not expected to watch it happen to Warren Gallagher's operation. She had prepared for it anyway. The documentation Roy Keller sent arrived on the 14th day, certified exactly as the statute required. She signed for it at the mailbox and carried it inside and read it at the kitchen table. The amendment record for the Gallagher Holdings water distribution proposal ran 43 pages. She read all 43. The subsurface assessment provision had been inserted in committee without a recorded vote, which was either a procedural error or an intentional omission. And the geological basis cited was a regional hydrology study from 1981 that predated the methodology for identifying isolated fault line aquifer channels by 2 decades. She wrote a response. 3 paragraphs. The first cited the procedural irregularity. The second cited the obsolete geological basis. The third stated that any attempt to access the Roth Farm subsurface without a current and independently verified geological assessment would be contested under water rights statute as well as property trespass. She sent it certified mail and made 2 copies. She did not hear from the county water board for 14 months after that. What she heard instead from Leroy Briggs's son, who still worked a small operation on the north end of the valley, was that Gallagher Holdings had entered into a preliminary agreement with a regional agribusiness corporation called Meridian Agricorp for the acquisition of the full Gallagher property portfolio. The deal required verified water access certification. The Gallagher primary water source was showing declining yield indicators. The preliminary status had been holding for 18 months. On the nightstand beside her bed, Tom's photograph lay face down. She had turned it over 2 summers ago, without planning to had come in from the fields one evening, and found herself reaching for the frame, and she had not examined the reason closely enough to name it. She left it face down. It was still there. She was 67 years old in the August that Warren Gallagher came down from his hill. Her hair had gone the gray of weathered fence posts, and she wore it cropped close. The left shoulder had been wrong for 20 years and would be wrong until she died, a fact she had made her peace with by the end of the first year. She moved around the farm with the economy of a person who has calibrated every motion against a permanent limitation. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. The pump ran. The cattle ran on water that tasted of iron and sulfur and ancient geology, and the cattle were a crossbred composite she had selected over 2 decades for the specific quality of not caring about any of those things. She was in the machine shed at 7 a.m. when she heard the engine on the county road. She did not look up immediately. Trucks came down this road with enough regularity that the sound alone was not information. But this engine slowed with the particular deceleration of something uncertain about its welcome, something that knew where it was going but had not fully arrived at the willingness to go there. She put the angle grinder down and went to the doorway. The pickup was 10 years old, and the color it had started as was no longer identifiable under the sun fade and road dust. It moved at the pace of a vehicle whose driver was measuring the distance between the decision already made and the moment of having to act on it. She recognized the shape of the cab before she could see the driver clearly. She had watched that truck move across the high ground above her property for 2 decades, had watched it represent everything the valley had ceded to one man's preparation, and one man's willingness to let his neighbors fail when failing served his interest. The truck turned into her approach road and stopped at the gate. She walked from the shed to the gate at her usual pace. The gate was padlocked, had been padlocked for 6 years, since the second time Decker had come uninvited. Warren Gallagher stepped out. The years had taken from him in the specific way they take from men who have lived inside the insulation of resources. It is not the same aging that comes from working in weather. It is a deflation. The heavy shoulders were still structurally present, but had turned inward, and his skin had the mottled texture of a man who had spent recent summers outside more than he was accustomed to, managing a failing operation personally rather than through oversight. His hair was gone at the scalp, burned pink at the crown. He was wearing jeans that were not pressed and boots with actual dirt on them. She looked at his truck through the gate bars. On the passenger seat, visible through the window, was a manila folder with a printed label in green and gray corporate formatting. She had seen that color scheme on Meridian Agricorp documentation 4 months prior. She could not read the text from this distance and did not need to. Warren said Nadine. She said Warren. He held his cap in both hands at his waist. He looked at the gate. He said, I know this isn't a conversation you were expecting. She said, It is exactly a conversation I was expecting. Say what you came to say. He said it plainly, which she gave him credit for. His upper pump had been pulling sand for 2 weeks. The static level had dropped past his primary intake. He had shifted to the deep bore, but the pressure was down to a fraction of operational yield. 300 head of feeder cattle were 3 weeks from optimal market weight. If he could not water them, they would drop out of grade, and his equipment notes were already in default discussion with the bank. He said, I need a tanker truck a day to the end of the month. I'll pay county rate. I'll put it in writing. She said county rate is 2 cents a gallon. He said, That's right. That's what I'm offering. She said, From me, it is 6 cents. His expression moved. Not the flash of anger she might have expected from the man who had stood on his porch 20 years ago with a glass of iced tea and pointed at her dead hole. What moved across his face now was the specific look of a man who has steeled himself for difficult terms and has still not prepared adequately for the actual number. He said, Nadine, that is 3 times the market. She said, My pump runs on diesel. My impeller wears against 80 feet of depth. The water I have exists because I went down a shaft with a 90-pound breaker and 1 functioning arm and broke through basalt by hand. The water you need does not exist anywhere else in this valley within the distance your tanker can run and return in a working day. Market rate is for water that exists in adequate supply. My water is the only supply you have. Those are different markets. He looked at the padlocked gate. He was doing the arithmetic. She let him do it. He said, We're neighbors, Nadine. She said, We share a property line. That is a boundary, not a relationship. I know the difference. She said, There are 3 conditions. Before the first tanker fills, you sign a legal agreement prepared by my attorney. No transfer of any subsurface resource rights within 2 miles of our shared boundary to any third party without written consent from me. No exceptions. No time limitations. Warren said, Nadine. She said, Second, you withdraw the Gallagher Holdings water distribution proposal in second cycle county board review. All filings. Complete withdrawal. He went very still. He said, You cannot ask me to. She said, Third, cashier's check at this gate before 6 in the morning for the volume taken the previous day. The valve does not open until the check is in my hand. If the check is late, the valve stays shut. If it does not clear, it stays shut permanently. Warren said, The Meridian deal. She said, I know about Meridian. I knew before you drove down here this morning. He was quiet for a moment that stretched into something different. The silence that happens when a man finally understands the full geometry of the position he is in and has no move remaining that changes any of its dimensions. He said, You had this prepared. She said, Since the year Roy Keller came to my gate with an EP, a compliance order, and your truck was parked on the road behind him. He looked at her directly for the first time since getting out of the truck. The authority he had carried on his porch 20 years ago was entirely absent. The voice that had filled a space without effort. The posture of a man who had never needed to recalculate. None of it was present. What was present was a 65-year-old man in dusty jeans, holding his cap with both hands and looking at a padlocked gate. He said, All right. She said, My attorney's office opens at 8. The document will be ready by noon. Come back at 1 with a notary. We sign at the gate. Your first tanker can fill this afternoon, he said. All right. He turned to his truck. She watched him get in and start the engine and back out of the approach road and turn east toward the county road. The dust his tires raised moved slowly in the August air and then settled, and the gate was the gate it had always been, and she felt nothing that had a clean name. Not triumph and not relief, and not the satisfaction she had imagined on the worst nights of the 20 years between his porch and this morning, just the particular flatness that follows the completion of something long carried. The weight does not become joy when it is set down. It simply becomes absence, and absence after that much weight is its own adjustment. She went inside and called her attorney. 6 days after the first tanker payment cleared, and she opened the valve for the first time, Roy Keller came back to the gate alone. Not the county SUV, but his personal truck, a blue Silverado. He was not in the dark vest. Plain work shirt, no clipboard, hands in his pockets when she came to the gate. The posture of a man who is not here in any official capacity and wants that understood from the beginning. She said, Roy, he said I won't take much of your time. He reached into his shirt pocket and extended an envelope through the gate bars. She took it. The return address was the State Department of Natural Resources Subsurface Resources Division. She opened it. The certificate inside identified the subsurface water source beneath the Roth farm property as a geologically isolated channel system, following the Western Fault Escarpment, classified as independent of and hydrologically distinct from the regional aquifer system. Full extraction and distribution rights. No shared use limitations. No metering requirement. Document number W-04471, issued to Nadine A. Roth. She read it twice. She folded it and held it. She said, How long have you been working on this? He said geological verification took 14 months. Gallagher Holdings filed 3 classification objections over 9 years. The final determination came down 8 months ago. I submitted the initial request the week after I read your father's notebooks at your gate. The first time. She said Warren doesn't know about this yet. Doesn't know, he said. He knows as of this morning. His attorney called my supervisor. There is nothing to contest. The subsurface classification is geological fact. It was always geological fact. It needed someone to document it correctly. She looked at him through the gate bars. She had misjudged him at the start, had been right to be careful and wrong about his ultimate direction, and both things could be true without requiring a ceremony of acknowledgement. She said, My father should have seen this, Roy said. Your father documented everything that needed to be documented. He did not know the state would eventually be interested. The statute enabling this classification did not exist until 2019. Clarence Roth should have seen this come back. It was a slightly formal thing to say the kind of statement offered when a person wants to give something and is uncertain of its precise shape. She understood it was meant honestly. She said, Thank you, Roy. He nodded once. He went to his truck and drove out without hurrying, and the sound of his engine faded north on the county road, and she stood at the gate with the certificate in her right hand until the dust settled completely. She went inside. She walked through the kitchen past Patsy's biscuit recipe card on the counter in its tin box, through the hall and into the bedroom. She stood at the nightstand and looked at the photograph lying face down on the surface. She picked it up and turned it over and set it standing upright against the lamp base, Tom Roth grinning with the corners of his mouth going crooked and the effort of not showing the full extent of it, his eyes doing the actual work. She looked at the photograph for the length of several breaths. She did not need to say anything to it. She had brought this farm through 20 years and a broken shoulder and a water certificate issued in her name, and she was not going to explain any of that to a picture. She had done those things. The photograph could stand upright now. That was sufficient. She went back to the kitchen and opened Patsy's tin box and read the recipe card. 2 cups flour, 1 tablespoon baking powder, ½ teaspoon salt, 1/4 cup cold lard, 3/4 cup buttermilk. Cut the lard in until the mixture resembles coarse sand. Do not overwork the dough. The instruction at the end was not written anywhere on the card because some things Patsy assumed were understood by anyone who had ever made anything worth eating. She had the flour measured and the lard out of the refrigerator when she heard the truck on the county road slowing for her driveway. The engine was her son's. She had known that sound since the purchase. She heard the approach road, the parkings, the side door through the mudroom, the specific stop in the mudroom, longer than boot removal required. Something being set down, something with weight to it. Dale came into the kitchen carrying a cardboard box with a tool case balanced on top. He set both on the floor beside the refrigerator. He said, "The relay switch on the pump control panel. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. You mentioned it once on the phone, and I looked up the specs on the generator pump interface. That relay is original equipment. It's going to fail. She looked at him. He was 42 years old with his father's height and his father's way of carrying weight in his hands when standing still. The smoothness she had noticed in his hands 10 years ago was not entirely gone, but was no longer the dominant quality. There was a callus forming on the right palm, not the full landscape of a life and work, but a beginning. She said, "The replacement part is on the shelf above the drill press. Orange bag. I ordered it in March and didn't get to it." He said, "I know the size." I looked it up. She said, "Shelf above the drill press." He went out through the side door. She listened to his steps cross the yard to the machine shed, listened to the shed door turned back to the recipe card. She had the lard cut into the flour by the time he returned. He went directly behind the refrigerator, pulling it from the wall to access the panel, a thing she had mentioned in passing 2 years ago, without expecting it to be remembered at all. She heard him crouch behind the refrigerator, with a flashlight in his teeth, the way Tom had crouched in this exact position for this exact reason in a different decade. He said from behind the refrigerator, "This panel should probably be replaced entirely. The whole thing is original to the house wiring." She said, "I know." He said, "I can do it in a weekend if you have the parts list together." She said, "I can put together the parts list." The buttermilk went in cold, and she worked it with a fork until the dough came together. Lumpy and slightly tacky, the texture the card described without describing, because Patsy had understood that some instruction only makes sense in the hands. She turned it onto the floured board and patted it to thickness without rolling. The biscuit cutter was in the drawer below the oven, behind implements she could not immediately identify the purpose of. Dale came out from behind the refrigerator and stood up and said, "New relay is in. Should hold another 20 years if the panel doesn't go first." She said, "There is a stool there." He pulled it from the corner and sat at the counter across from her. He watched her cut circles from the dough and set them on the baking sheet. He did not speak, and she did not speak, and the silence between them was not the silence of 10 years ago when she had told him to leave. Not the silence of the phone calls that had been careful and adequate and maintained a shape without filling it. This was a different silence. The silence of a kitchen where two people are occupied and present, and not requiring anything from each other beyond the fact of being in the same room. She slid the sheet into the oven. She set the mechanical timer on the stove, the one that had been on the stove since before she was born. It ticked. Dale said, "I heard Gallagher is selling to Meridian. Just the upper parcel now. The water certification on your property complicated the full portfolio valuation. Meridian dropped their offer on the valley parcels." She said, "That is his business to manage." Dale said, "You knew that would happen when you filed for the certification." She said, "I knew the independent classification would affect a portfolio dependent on shared aquifer access." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that I understand what you built here. Not just the water, all of it. I understand it in a way I didn't have the capacity for when I was 22. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just wanted to say it in this kitchen." She looked at him across the counter. He was not performing remorse for her benefit. He was not constructing an apology in the shape that most benefited him. He had arrived at something on his own and was choosing to say it directly, which was the only kind of statement she had ever had genuine use for. She said, "I know you do." The timer ticked between them. Outside, the pump ran its cycle in the south ravine, the sound of it reaching through the kitchen window and mixing with the August air and the faint mineral smell that had never entirely left this property and never would. The timer rang. She pulled the biscuits from the oven. They had risen the way Patsy's card described, without describing it in words evenly and with a slight lean on the outer ones from the imperfect level of the oven she had meant to adjust for 15 years. She set the rack on the counter. Dale looked at them for a moment and said, "She made these every single time I came to her place as a kid. I didn't know you had her recipe." She said, "She left it when she went." She set the rack on the table between them. They ate without ceremony. The biscuits were not identical to Patsy's, because nothing made by someone other than Patsy could be. But they carried the recipe, the transmission, the intention behind the index card written carefully by a woman who understood that what a person leaves behind matters more than what they take. They were warm, and they were in this kitchen, and that was what they were. After Dale had driven back to the county road, and the sound of his truck had faded north, she went out in the evening to walk the property the way she walked it every evening, checking the ditch flow, the pressure gauge, the cattle in the lower pasture. The August heat had broken slightly, with a western draw that moved dust across the yard and also moved air, the first air, with any direction to it in 3 weeks. She stopped at the black storage tanks. The nearest tank was warm under her right palm, sun-heated metal holding the temperature of the day. Inside it, 200,000 gallons of water that was heavy with iron and sulfur, and the memory of sealed centuries. Water that had tried to drown her and had instead made her the last operating farm in this valley. It stained everything it touched. It smelled of something no amount of time made pleasant. She had stopped apologizing for either of those things a very long time ago. She reached into her chest pocket and took out the notebooks. Both of them, her father's and the one she had started the year after, carried together since the night she had climbed the cable with one arm in total darkness. She opened her father's notebook to the entry from August 14th, 1987. His careful printing. The observation about the vibration at 70 feet. The note about returning in 1989 to leave the sketch. She took the ballpoint pen from the same pocket and held the notebook flat against the tank with her right palm, and she wrote below her father's last line, in her own hand smaller than his and steadier than she had any right to expect from a hand that had been through what this one had been through. She wrote, "Went down, found it, kept it, She capped the pen and closed the notebook and put both back in her chest pocket. The pump ran its cycle in the south ravine, the sound of it moving across the flat ground and finding her where she stood, the low mechanical alternating pulse that had been the sound of this place for 20 years. She had been many things in the presence of that sound, angry and exhausted and isolated and vindicated in ways that turned out to cost more than losing would have. She had no more to become in relation to it. It was simply the sound of the farm working, and the farm working was the farm surviving, and the farm surviving was everything she had traded everything else to preserve. She stood with her palm on the warm metal, and she listened. The thud of the pump did not stop. It had not stopped in 20 years, and it would not stop tonight. It asked the same price every day. She paid it every day. That was the arrangement, and the arrangement was hers, made on her land, with her equipment above her water that a piece of paper in her chest pocket confirmed belonged to no one else and had never belonged to anyone else. She thought about her father standing at this same ravine with broken drill bits and a pencil, and the particular courage of a man who writes down what he knows even when he cannot act on it, who wraps the knowledge in oilcloth and lowers it back into the dark to wait for whoever comes next with sufficient reason to go down after it. She thought about Tom showing her how to read soil color for moisture depth, his voice patient in the way of a man who understood that knowledge is only useful when it reaches someone. She thought about Patsy Weaver handing her a county water board notice across the hood of a primer gray Ford Ranger without making it into more than information, because some people understand that what a person in a hard place needs is information and proximity, and not to be required to process either of those things as sentiment. The western draw moved through the yard and lifted a thin curtain of dust and set it back down. She took her hand off the tank. She walked back toward the house through the evening that was finally minimally cooler, past the irrigation ditches running their orange-stained water, south past the shed where the angle grinder waited for morning, past the porch where the boards held the shape of decades of boots. She went inside. The kitchen still held the warmth of the oven and the smell of the biscuits. Patsy's recipe card sat on the counter beside the empty tin box. She would put it away properly tomorrow. Tonight, she left it where it was. She went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress and felt the familiar accounting of the day in her back and her hip and the left shoulder that had been wrong for 20 years. She reached over and turned off the lamp. In the dark beside the lamp, Tom's photograph stood upright. She lay back, and the sound of the pump found her through the walls of the house. She had been born in, steady and even, and entirely without mercy, and entirely without sentiment. And it was the sound of the land working, and the sound of water coming up from the dark, and the sound of the life she had made from a dead hole, and a broken shoulder, and a father's pencil lines and 20 years of rising before the sun to pay what the ground required. It was not the sound of winning. It was the sound of home.